Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Finding a Mother for Rosie by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. Boston, September 1882. I must truly thank you for your time, Ms. Brown. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed a walk quite as much as I did with you today, Matthew Smith said with a charming smile. Mabel Brown blushed slightly. She was only 18, but even so, she knew that what she was feeling was love. When the news of her parents' tragic train accident had reached her 6 months before, Mabel had been distraught. In a single tragedy, she had lost both her parents, the total sum of her family. Although they had left her a beautiful brownstone and quite a large sum of money, Mabel had never thought she would be happy again. After all, money can't buy happiness. For the month after first losing her parents, Mabel had resigned herself to staying at home and wearing black. She had never thought a handsome bachelor like Matthew Smith could ever be interested in her. Although he was 25 years her senior, Mabel adored him. He was handsome, charming, and the perfect gentleman. On that very first night when he had approached her at a dinner party at her friend's house, Mabel had been sure at first that he had approached the wrong girl until he invited her outside for a breath of fresh air. Mabel had known that his invitation had nothing to do with fresh air and rather the privacy it would afford them. Before that, Mabel had only ever interacted with men of her own age and found Matthew's wisdom and experience intriguing. He could tell her about places she'd never seen, enthrall her with life experiences she had yet to live, and more than anything, he made her feel special, as if someone else could appreciate her apart from the family she had lost. Smiling at her now from the steps of her brownstone home, he made her feel special. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Brown." Matthew glanced at the door and back at Mabel, before the corners of his mouth curved into a grin. "I expect it's too soon to hope to be invited in for coffee?" Mabel glanced at the door and knew that it would be acceptable since her housekeeper was always in the vicinity. Until now, her visits with Matthew had been comprised of walks, meeting each other for lunch, and seeing each other at dinner parties hosted by their mutual friends. She couldn't help but hope that their budding romance would lead to something more permanent soon, and felt her heart skip a beat at the thought of becoming Mrs. Matthew Smith. "Now that you mention it, I am quite in need of a coffee myself. Would you like to come in for coffee, Mr. Smith?" Mabel asked shyly. At 18, she was the lady of the house and yet as innocent and naive as to be expected. Matthew took off his hat with a smile as he opened the door for her to enter first. They were barely through the door before the housekeeper stopped in her steps with a wide-eyed look. "Ms. Brown?" Mabel took off her gloves as she smiled at the housekeeper. "Could you prepare a tray of coffee for the drawing room, please?" Mabel didn't wait for her to answer before she moved to the drawing room. Now wasn't the time to be questioned, especially not by her servants. She led the way to the drawing room, where a fire was happily crackling in the hearth. Although it was only early fall, the large brownstone could be quite chilly when the sun failed to shine, such as on days like today. Mabel had barely taken a seat when the housekeeper returned with a tray. "Something stronger for you, Mr. Smith?" "That would be wonderful. Thank you. Scotch, 2 fingers." Mabel felt grown up having a male visitor over and watching as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The last person to drink from that decanter had been her father. Mabel knew that he had always imported his whiskey from Scotland, saying it was the only kind worth his time. "I must say, Mabel, this is fine Scotch you have here," Mr. Smith said approvingly. Mabel nodded with a sad smile. "It was my father's favorite." "You must feel terribly lonely after their passing?" Matthew took a seat across from Mabel as he waited for her response. Mabel didn't want to reveal her weakness or her grief, and instead kept her shoulders straight and her chin up as she spoke. "It was hard at first, but I've come to terms with it. Luckily, I have a beautiful home and good friends with whom to spend my time." Matthew set his glass down as he moved towards Mabel. When he kneeled before her, Mabel was certain that he was going to console her over her loss. Instead, he gently reached for her hand as he searched her eyes. His sparkling green eyes searched her gaze, making Mabel feel as if she was the only girl in the world. Although his dark hair was peppered with gray, to Mabel, Matthew was the most attractive man she had ever laid eyes on. "My dearest Mabel, from the first moment I met you, I knew that my heart reached out to you. Over these last few months, I have been forcing myself to take things slowly, not to rush you, because for me it was love at first sight. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Mabel's breath caught, even as her heart stopped. She had only been spending time with Matthew for the last 2 months, and this was the last thing she expected might happen today. The doubts faded in her mind as she looked into Matthew's eyes and saw her future. "I'd be honored." Before she could protest, Matthew pulled her up and framed her face with both his hands. "You won't ever regret it. I'm going to make you the happiest woman alive." In that moment, Mabel knew that although she had lost her family in a tragic train accident, God was smiling down at her by giving her Matthew Smith. Chapter 2. Boston, October 1882. "You are engaged?" Anna Stone asked, not excited in the least. Mabel couldn't understand why her friend didn't share in her excitement, although that didn't stop the smile from splitting her face in two. "I know it's rather soon. I know we've hardly known each other for but a few months. But I love him, Anna." Anna shook her head. "Mabel, I love you more than I could have loved my own sister, but I can't help but feel concerned." Anna held Mabel's gaze. "Very concerned." "Why would you say that?" Mabel asked, a little offended. "Mabel, I know you haven't courted much, but surely even you know that Matthew Smith is quite the charmer. He has never married, has a different girl on his arm every season, and has made it blatantly clear to his ladies in the past that he had no intention of ever becoming a father or a husband. Can you blame me for feeling concerned that he's proposed so suddenly?" Anna set her cup of tea down and folded her hands in her lap as she questioned Mabel. Mabel had all but floated to her friend's house earlier that day, and now she couldn't help but wish she hadn't come at all. She and Anna had been friends for as long as Mabel could remember, and when she had lost her parents, Anna had been the one to support her. And now it felt as if Anna was jealous of her wealth and happiness. "Of course I'm not concerned that he proposed so soon. He has never married because he has never fallen in love until now. That's why he asked me. Why can't you just be happy for me?" Mabel asked defiantly. Anna shook her head with a heavy sigh. "Mabel, if I truly believed that he loved you, I would have been over the moon. But I can't help but feel that you were left quite wealthy after your parents passed." For a moment, Mabel couldn't understand what her wealth had to do with Matthew, and then her eyes widened with horror. "Surely you're not suggesting that Matthew was only with me because of my wealth? He's a wealthy man in his own right. He wouldn't need my money." "What about his gambling problem? Or have you conveniently forgotten about that as well? It's common knowledge to anyone who knows Matthew that he has a penchant for gambling. Are you sure that won't bother you?" Anna asked, continuing her barrage of questions. "I honestly thought you would be supportive and happy for me, but it feels rather as if you are finding every reason in the book to withhold your blessing on my engagement," Mabel remarked, standing up with a huff. "I don't need your blessing." Anna stood too and moved towards her friend, taking her hands in her own. "Mabel, of course I'm happy for you. I know how lonely you've been since your parents passed. I also know that you've been dreaming of becoming a wife and a mother ever since we were little girls. But we're not little girls anymore. This is the real world, and not all men are like the princes in fairy tales." Mabel narrowed her eyes. "Matthew is the prince in my fairy tale," Anna sighed. "I just don't want you hurt by a man who has a reputation for philandering. If you honestly believe that Matthew is the right man for you, and that he will love and honor you for the rest of your life, then of course I give you my blessing. And I wish you the best of luck and all the love and children in the world. Just promise me one thing, Mabel." Mabel carefully looked at her friend, wondering what the promise could possibly be. "What would you like me to promise?" Anna held her gaze as she spoke quietly. Don't give him control of your money. Because you're not yet 21, your parents' estate attorney wouldn't hesitate to let you sign over control. Mabel shoved her friend's hands away and shook her head defiantly. Prosody. If you give your heart to someone, you don't give it believing they are thieves. I trust Matthew. Mabel didn't add that she had of course already asked her lawyer to grant Matthew access to her funds. She felt even more angered by the doubt that crept up her spine, which hadn't been there until she had come to share her news with her best friend. I never should have come here. I thought you'd be happy for me. Instead, you sound like a jealous little girl who didn't get a doll from Santa Claus. I'm sorry you feel that way, but perhaps before you storm out and never talk to me again, you should remember that I am the closest you have to a family. I care for you as I care for family. I'm only saying this because I care, not because I am jealous. He is double your age, Mabel. I just want you to be sure. And I am sure. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said yes, now would I? Mabel reached for her small purse to leave. Reaching the door, she turned and looked at her friend, anger bubbling in her veins. Don't bother finding a dress for the wedding. You won't be invited. Mabel walked home, feeling simultaneously disappointed and angry. She knew Matthew's reputation, but the Bible preached that anyone could change with the grace of God. The way in which Matthew spoke of the Lord made it clear that he had turned his life around. The way he had expressed his dreams of the future with her made Mabel a firm believer that he truly loved her. She wouldn't allow a friend to spoil what she had found with Matthew. Instead, it would be better to cut that friend loose and to focus on her impending marriage to a very handsome man. As she walked home, Mabel refused to pay any attention to the trickle of doubt that circled her mind. Chapter 3. Boston, January 1883. Thanksgiving and Christmas had come and gone, and although Mabel had spent those special days with Matthew, it had been her first Christmas without her family. To make matters even worse, she hadn't seen Anna. She missed Anna terribly, although she couldn't forgive her friend for what she had said. To accuse Matthew of such things was unforgivable, especially given how wonderful he had been to her. For Christmas, he had surprised her with a beautiful ruby necklace, promising to give her the matching bracelet on their wedding day. Mabel let out a sigh as she glanced out the window. The snow was falling in breezy drifts, but as soon as they stuck to the ground, they turned black with muck and dirt. She couldn't help but wonder if that wasn't what her life was coming to. When they had become engaged, Mabel had been over the moon. She had looked past all Matthew's faults, reminding herself that she wasn't without fault either, but now she wondered if she could keep ignoring them. She truly loved Matthew. In all honesty, she loved the security and the attention she got from him, but she didn't like him canceling their arrangements for reasons she couldn't believe was true. Twice over the last month, he had canceled an appointment with her, citing business responsibilities, only to let it slip later that he'd attended a social occasion without her. On one occasion, he had arrived terribly late, smelling of cheap scent and very clearly more than a little tipsy, claiming he'd been in the office. Little by little, the doubts Mabel had on the day she had walked out of Anna's life began to pile up. Was Matthew truly the man she believed him to be, or was he the man Anna had warned her about? They had yet to set a wedding date, and although it had been Matthew who had delayed at first, saying that they should wait for the new year, Mabel couldn't help but wonder if she was even ready to set a date now. She couldn't help but wonder where he was tonight. After lunch with friends, Mabel had heard about a gentleman's party taking place tonight. She knew a gentleman's party was their way of describing female entertainment and alcohol, and she didn't care for it at all. In social circles, it wasn't uncommon for a wife to turn her head or her ear to scandalous news about her husband. If there had been an affair, it would be swept under the rug like ash that had spilled from the fireplace. If there had been abuse, it would be covered with rouge and explained as an unfortunate fall. All this to secure the lives they had become acquainted with. But for Mabel, the situation was very different indeed. Firstly, she wasn't yet married. She could still call off the engagement if she so chose. It would cause a ruckus in society, and she would probably be ostracized for it, but it was at least an option. Secondly, Mabel wasn't dependent on Matthew's wealth. Her parents had left her with their beautiful brownstone home and enough money to live very comfortably for the rest of her life. She didn't need a husband, but she desperately wanted one. She loved the way it felt to have Matthew introduce her as his fiancé. She enjoyed his company, listening to him speak about his life and the wonderful adventures he planned to take her on. If she was honest, she loved that she was no longer alone. But was that enough to secure a marriage? When the brass knocker on the front door sounded, Mabel was out of her seat before the housekeeper could even leave the kitchen. She pulled the door open with a wide smile, eager to spend an evening with Matthew to chase away all her doubts. She knew that if she spent time with him, she would realize once again how wonderful he was. "Good evening, Matthew." Mabel welcomed him with a smile. "You're a sight for sore eyes." Matthew's voice slurred slightly, but Mabel ignored it. It wasn't wrong for a man to have a drink after a hard day's work. "Come here, you." Matthew pulled her close and gave her a smacking kiss. Mabel struggled free, laughing. "Matthew Smith, what on earth do you think you're doing?" Matthew shrugged with a handsome grin. "Showing the girl I love that I do indeed love her." Mabel felt a blush color her cheeks as she led him to the drawing room. "Then perhaps it's time you tell that girl when you plan on getting married." Matthew chuckled under his breath. "As soon as the vicar will let me. Mabel, I'm tired of waiting. I want to love you. I want to be your husband, in all the ways that count." Mabel felt a flush of love race through her veins. How could she have doubted Matthew? There was love in his gaze as he looked at her. Surely he had left his philandering ways behind him. Her laughter drifted through the drawing room. "I take it you stopped by the gentleman's party on your way home." "I did," Matthew admitted with a smile. "Just made me realize how lucky I am to have you to come home to. You're such a beautiful woman, Mabel. A woman over whom I have the envy of every man." Mabel blushed shyly. "You're just being nice because you're feeling happy from all the drink." Matthew shook his head as he reached for her hand. "I'm being honest because all the drink is making me speak from the heart." At that moment, Mabel had not a single doubt in her mind. She loved Matthew and he loved her, and regardless of what her friend thought, she was going to marry this man as soon as the vicar would allow. "Is there anything else you need from me?" the housekeeper asked from the doorway. "No, that is all. Thank you. You're relieved of your duties for the night," Mabel said, stepping back. When she turned to look at her fiancé, his eyes were shining with love. Matthew's smile curved even further. "I knew you were a clever woman. Besides, an engaged couple doesn't need a chaperone in this modern age." Chapter 4. Boston, March 1883. Mabel sat at the dining room table, waiting for Matthew to arrive home. Her heart was racing, not knowing how he might react to her news. Although their engagement had stretched on for months, a wedding date was yet to be decided on. In January, matters between them had looked up, and for a short while, Mabel had truly believed that the wedding was imminent, until Matthew's visits became few, and it felt as if he was creating a distance between them. Mabel had assured herself not to think anything of this, but now she couldn't help but wonder if allowing Matthew into her bed had been the beginning of their problems. Tonight, she had another problem to discuss with Matthew, one that wouldn't just go away, one that Mabel believed would create an even greater distance between them unless he had a sudden change of heart. She heard the housekeeper let Matthew into the house and drew in a sharp breath, steeling herself against the conversation she was about to have. "Waiting for me at the table already?" "I didn't realize the time," Matthew said rather abruptly as he took a seat at the table. Mabel smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes as she folded a napkin in her lap. "You didn't. Dinner was ready, and so I decided to wait for you here. How was your day?" Matthew let out a sigh as he checked the time on his pocket watch. "Busy, and I've got a late-night meeting I have to get to." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interfere with your day. I just hoped we could share a quiet dinner together. It's been rather busy these last few weeks. I've missed you." Mabel said, hating the fact that she sounded dependent on him. I am a businessman, Mabel. You can't expect me to hang around you every day. You knew that when we met. Matthew said irritably. Mabel had hoped he would be in a better mood tonight, but since he wasn't, she had no choice but to go ahead and tell him what she had to say. I went to see the doctor today. Is something wrong? I didn't know you've been ill, Matthew asked, pretending to be concerned. Mabel couldn't help but feel that it was honest concern rather than just a question he was expected to ask. I'm not ill, but I have been concerned about feeling nauseous most of the time. Mabel drew in a deep breath before she met Matthew's gaze. I'm with child. Matthew's eyes widened in surprise before they narrowed with doubt. How can you be certain? People become nauseous for all sorts of reasons. I'm sure they do, but in my case, it's because I'll be having a child come September. Your child. Mabel emphasized the last part. Matthew stood and threw his napkin to the ground. Anger and disappointment clear in his face and every word that followed. How could you let this happen? I am a respected member of the community. This will not only tarnish my reputation, it might just ruin it. You are an unmarried young woman, and now you will bring scandal to this house. Scandal to me and to the memory of your parents. Mabel hardly ever became angry, but to feel the wrath of Matthew's anger wash over her like a tidal wave made something inside her snap. She stood up and slammed her hands on the table. Don't speak as if this is just my fault. It's your child, too. That's where you're making a mistake, Mabel. I don't have children. I don't want children, and I'm not going to have that child. Matthew shook his head with a wry grin. That is your problem, and you will not make your problem mine. Mabel couldn't believe the man she had believed to love her could act so harshly. They were to be married. He had asked for her hand, promised to spend the rest of his life with her, only to tell her that an unplanned pregnancy wasn't his problem. How can you be so cold? How can you act so cruel? Cruel? How can you be so irresponsible? There are ways to stop these things from happening. I should never have expected a young girl such as you would know better. You're a fool, Mabel, a fool who has just ruined both our lives. Matthew shook his head with a sigh. For a moment, silence hung in the dining room. Mabel felt tears quietly roll over her cheeks. She swallowed them back when Matthew looked up and held her gaze. You're not ruining my life, not you or that baby. This is your problem, and it's going to stay your problem. The engagement is off. Mabel gasped. What? You can't abandon me like this. Matthew's laughter felt like acid on Mabel's skin. Abandon? I'm not abandoning you, Mabel. I'm simply taking care of myself. Do you think I became respected and wealthy by not looking out for myself first? I don't want children, and I've just realized that I want you even less. A woman with a little more experience is much more to my liking. Mabel was speechless. She couldn't believe his cruel words. She couldn't believe that she had fallen for his charm and sweet promises. She had given him her heart, soul, and body, only to be kicked to the curb. Matthew, please, you can't leave me like this. What will people say? They will know you abandoned me. Matthew frowned with a smug grin. That's what you think. I'll make sure they know better. I'll make sure they know about the men you entertain when I'm not around. There won't be a doubt in anyone's mind that the baby is not mine. But it is yours, Mabel cried out desperately. Prove it, Matthew said quietly, steel behind his voice. He grabbed his coat and walked out without saying another word. When the housekeeper walked into the dining room a few seconds later, Mabel was too ashamed to meet her gaze. I couldn't help but overhear, dearie. It'll be all right. We'll take care of that baby together. You don't need a man like Matthew Smith. You have everything your parents left you, the housekeeper assured her as she set down a plate in front of Mabel. Just the scent of the food made her stomach turn. I can't. The housekeeper smiled. I'll make you toast and tea instead. The first few months can be hard on some women. Mabel smiled gratefully. Thank you. When the housekeeper left, Mabel allowed the tears to fall. Her heart felt as if a train had just slammed into it. When the doctor had told her of the pregnancy, she had been excited for a short while. But now, Mabel couldn't help but fear that Matthew would do just as he said. If people believed she entertained men while affianced, her reputation would be ruined. How could she look people in the eye knowing what they thought? For the first time since Matthew Smith had laid eyes on her, Mabel regretted ever meeting him. She should have known better. She should have listened to Anna, but instead she listened to her lying, naive heart. She brushed the tears away and touched a hand to her belly. "We'll find a way, baby. We'll find a way to make it through. Just know that no matter what happens, even if you never meet your father, you are already loved." Her heart clenched in her chest, knowing that she had made a mistake she would have to pay for the rest of her life. Chapter 5. Boston, April 1883. After the horrible night in March during which Mabel had relayed the news of her pregnancy to Matthew, she hadn't seen him for 6 weeks. She kept to herself, barely going out at all. Hating the idea of people whispering behind her back about the lies Matthew no doubt had started to spread. The only person who knew of her situation was the housekeeper and her best friend Anna. Anna had been a constant source of support, the only person other than her housekeeper who didn't lay judgment or shame upon her. Mabel had come to look forward to their weekly visits. It was the highlight of her week to spend time with Anna. For a few moments, she didn't think of Matthew or his cruel behavior. For a few moments, she didn't think of the baby growing inside her. Her belly had begun to grow, and although she could still hide it with coats and loose-fitting dresses, it wouldn't be long before everyone would know about her pregnancy. Mabel couldn't help but feel ashamed of the scandal and ruin she had brought to her family name. Every night she prayed that God would send her an answer, an option that wouldn't ruin her family name, a way for her to be able to carry her head high and not fear the gossip. But until now, an answer was yet to come. She waited in the drawing room for Anna to arrive. The housekeeper had baked a cake especially for the occasion, chocolate cake, as it was Anna's favorite. When the brass knocker on the front door sounded, Mabel smiled, eager to see her friend. But it wasn't Anna who joined her in the drawing room, but rather Matthew. "Matthew?" Mabel asked, surprised. "Good day, Mabel. I was hoping we could talk," Matthew asked humbly with his hat in his hand. This wasn't the same Matthew who had been cruel and cold just a month before. "About what?" Mabel asked, disconcerted. "About our situation," Matthew said heavily. "I think I need to explain why I fear becoming a father instead of just leaving you." Mabel nodded towards a seat. Matthew sat and dropped his hands on his knees. "I don't think you know anything about my childhood. It wasn't what one could call blessed." "I never knew that," Mabel said curiously. "What happened?" "My father was too fond of the bottle. My mother, it doesn't matter. They're gone now. What matters is that I know how hard life can be. I know the challenges children face these days. I can't have a child I know will depend on me. I can't stand the thought, Mabel." Matthew trailed off, his voice breaking with emotion. "Why are you here then?" Mabel snapped, trying to control her own emotions. "I'm here because I can't just walk away from my responsibility. It's only right that I help," Matthew said, meeting her gaze for the first time. "What are you suggesting, Matthew?" Mabel asked, confused. "I'm saying that I want us to marry, Mabel. I'll reinstate our engagement and make you my wife. I'll spend the rest of my life with you on one condition. You give up the baby." Mabel gasped with horror. "Give up my baby? To whom? I'm not giving my baby away, Matthew." "Mabel, be reasonable. If you don't agree to my terms, you'll be an unwed mother. No one will be associated with you. No one will invite you to parties or social gatherings. You'll be exiled. Your child will be exiled. What I am suggesting is that we continue with the wedding. That way, no one will question your pregnancy. In fact, they'll be happy for us," Matthew explained. "And what do we tell them when the baby is suddenly just gone?" Mabel asked, horrified. "We tell them that it died during birth. Of course, that won't be the case, Mabel. I'll find it a good family, a family who will give him everything he can desire. A family with a good name who will care for him and love him as their own. Then we can continue our lives without that burden." Mabel shook her head. "Matthew, I can't give my baby away. He's part of my life." "No, it isn't. It's a problem. That's what it is. This way, we keep our standing in society and we both remain free of the responsibility of a child. It's the best way. Don't you want what's best for the child?" "Of course I do, but..." Mabel began to argue. Then this is it. Either you give up the baby once it's born, or I leave now and you'll never see me again. Matthew stood up, making it clear he wanted an answer. Mabel's heart skipped a beat with fear. She was faced with the most impossible decision. Either she kept her baby and lived in scandal and ruin for the rest of her life, or she gave her baby up and married a handsome and wealthy man and kept scandal from her family name whilst the baby was cared for by a loving family. Her heart was shouting no, but her head was nodding eagerly. To bring shame to your family name was unacceptable. If she kept the child, Mabel knew she would lose her friends, and that the chances of her child ever having friends were slim to none. Thinking of her child, she finally nodded. We'll do it your way. But you have to promise me that the baby will be cared for by a good family. I want to know it's going to be the right family. Of course, I wouldn't expect anything less. I need to go, but I'll be back tomorrow. Then we can discuss how we are going to go about this. Mabel nodded heavily. She listened as his footsteps receded towards the front door. She touched her belly, struggling to accept that she wasn't going to raise it. When the housekeeper showed Anna into the drawing room, Mabel wiped the tears from her face as she met her friend's gaze. Mabel, what's happened? Anna asked, rushing to her side. Matthew, he came back. He wants us to reinstate the engagement. He wants us to get married, Mabel began. And the baby? Anna asked, surprised. I have to give the baby up. He doesn't want children. Mabel, no, you can't give up your baby. Anna quickly rushed to her side, pleading. Then what should I do? Keep it and raise it amidst scandal? He can find a good family that will raise it with love and kindness. He promised me it would be a family who will give it everything it needs. I have to do this, Anna. I can't bring shame to my family's name. Mabel finished firmly. Anna shook her head. Mabel, I can't help but feel that this isn't right. It's the best option I have, Mabel said with a sigh. There has to be another option, an option where you keep both your reputation and your child. What other option, Anna? I'm unwed, pregnant, and living off my family's legacy. When the money runs out one day, I'll have Matthew to care for me. I'll have my standing in society. I'll have you. Don't count me into that equation. You'll have me no matter what, Anna assured her. Perhaps, but will your husband one day accept that you are friends with an unwed mother? Probably not. Be reasonable, Anna. Matthew has just given me a way to do this right, if there even is such a thing. I'm taking it, and that's that. Anna held her gaze before she finally nodded. I just hope Matthew stays true to his word. He will, Mabel said with a hopeful smile. If he didn't care about me, he wouldn't have come to see me. Perhaps. Anna quickly shook her head. Never mind. Anna, what? Mabel encouraged her. I overheard someone mentioning the other day that abandoning you might be affecting a deal he has with one of your father's associates. Anna shrugged. I could have been wrong. It was at the bathhouse. I couldn't even see them, Mabel shrugged. It doesn't matter. He's come back, and I'm not going to be a fool twice. The first time got me pregnant. This time I'm making a clear, well-thought-through decision that will put my life back on the right track. Anna nodded. I hope so, Mabel. I truly hope so. Chapter 6, Utah, August 1883. It's 2 years today, Joe, Soaring Eagle said as he watched the sun touch the hills in the west. Joe Vallance glanced at his best friend and ranch hand and nodded with a quiet sigh. He didn't need to be reminded. He counted every day and would never forget the day on which he had lost his beautiful Elizabeth. Pa, come see, the pony is taking a carrot from me, Rosie said, rushing around the corner of the cabin. Joe set his cup down and opened his arms for his 4-year-old daughter. Without further invitation, she jumped into his waiting arms. Is he really? Come, Eagle, come see, Rosie addressed the Native American man beside her father. Although both Joe and Eagle had a long day of branding cattle, neither would deny the little girl. She was the light of their lives, the reason they got up in the morning, the reason they worked harder every year to grow the herd. Because Rosie deserved the world. Joe set Rosie down, and together they walked with Eagle to the small corral they had made for the pony. Told you he was stubborn as a mule, Joe said under his breath. Eagle chuckled. You just don't know how to listen to the soul of an animal. He's stubborn with you because you treat him as if he was. Rosie here treats him like a pet. That's why he acts like one with her. Eagle said with the wisdom passed down through generations of taming horses on the wide open plains. Joe watched as his daughter fed the pony another carrot and frowned when he noticed the pony seemed taller. Eagle, this ain't no colt. This is a filly. Eagle chuckled, the sound of his husky laughter drifting on the dust with the wind. Took you long enough to figure that out. 2 months, right, Rosie? Rosie giggled beside her father. 62 sleeps. Joe couldn't help but laugh. Rosie might not have a mother, but she had 2 fathers, and although he knew they would never replace a female influence, he could rest assured that his little girl was loved. Eagle scooped Rosie up and swung her in circles, making her laugh. Joe smiled at the sight. They were like 2 peas in a pod. He could still remember the day he had come across Eagle stranded on the side of the road, left to die. The uprisings between the settlers and the Indians had been at its height. Most men would have shot the man at first sight, but Joe saw his blood and knew that although they looked different and had different backgrounds, they both had the same color blood. Different and yet the same. He had helped Soaring Eagle onto his wagon, hidden him beneath a blanket, and nurtured him back to health. Soaring Eagle had been on his ranch in Utah ever since, and that had been more than 8 years ago. He was like a brother to Joe, and when Joe had lost Elizabeth, it had been Eagle who had kept the house going and cared for Rosie those first few grief-filled weeks. You run along and go wash up, and then you and I will cook sausages and grits for supper, Eagle said, setting the little girl down. Rosie rushed towards the house, excited at the thought of preparing dinner. I can't believe you fooled me into thinking that was a colt, Joe said, shaking his head with a wry grin. Eagle just shrugged. When your heart is filled with grief, it dims your vision. Stop it. I don't need you waxing on about quotes from your ancestors. I'm fine. Then do something about it, Eagle said firmly. Although technically Joe was his boss, their friendship extended far beyond those boundaries. It's been 2 years since I helped you put Elizabeth in the ground. She was a wonderful woman, Joe, but she's gone. It's time for you to accept that. You can't live the rest of your life beneath a cloud of grief. Think of Rosie. She deserves better. I don't. Joe began to argue, but knew Eagle was right. He dragged a hand through his hair before returning his hat. I loved Elizabeth from the moment we met. I remember, Eagle said with a reminiscent smile. It was around a year after you dragged me out here. You came back from town and couldn't stop talking about the new school marm. I knew then you were in for a lambastin'. Joe laughed. She basted me all right, tugged me right, taught me manners, and married me as a reward. Eagle, she wanted kids so bad, they just lit her up, you know. It wasn't your fault, Joe. It wasn't hers either. Sometimes life just has bigger plans than our own. Everything happened as it should, Eagle said, laying a hand on his friend's shoulder. I know, but I can't help but wonder if we did wrong. We adopted Rosie to give her everything she wouldn't have in the orphanage. Now what's she got, huh? She's got an Indian and a cowboy raising her. What do we know about making her a lady? We can teach her to rope a calf, to ride a horse, and to cook simple meals. But we can't teach her what a ma should. You gave that girl a safe home and more love than she would have known. Neither you nor Elizabeth could have foreseen that consumption would get her. It was fate's plan. You can either fight fate and blame it, or you can float on the breeze like a leaf. Are you going to stand in its way like a dead tree or float on the breeze, Joe? Eagle asked quietly. Joe watched as a few leaves were blown from a tree. He watched how they drifted on the breeze and let out a heavy sigh. I need to float, Eagle. But how? You need to open your heart. You need to think of the future. Rosie needs a ma, and I could use a good meal. It's time you said goodbye to Elizabeth and thought of the little girl who needs you. Without another word, Eagle turned and walked to the house. Joe had learned early on that Eagle wasn't one for conversations of the heart. But when he did have them, he left as soon as he had said his piece. His eye caught another leaf blowing on the breeze, and he realized Eagle was right. He needed to move on. He needed to find a mother for his daughter, and he needed to find joy again. It had been 2 years since he had felt that kind of contented joy. Although he doubted he would find love again, he accepted that he could at least find joy. Perhaps it was time to walk up the hill to say goodbye to Elizabeth and to find a woman willing to raise another man's adopted daughter. Joe glanced at the hill and began putting one foot in front of the other. When he reached the top of the hill, he drew in a deep breath and turned towards the sky. God, I believe that with your mercy, everything is possible. Help me find a woman willing to take on me and Rosie. A smile curved his mouth. And find a woman willing to take on the Indian that's become my conscience and my brother. Eagle needs to find joy as well. When Joe turned to Elizabeth's grave, his heart grew heavy. For the first time since her death, Joe realized he had never really said goodbye. For the last 2 years, he had visited her frequently, telling her about his life, about their daughter, and how much he missed her. He would always miss her, but it was time he shared his life with someone else. It was time for Rosie to have a woman as her mother, instead of just the ghost she hardly remembered. Chapter 7. Boston, September 1883. "Where's his Maria?" Matthew Smith asked as he walked through the factory. Around him, sewing machines were rhythmically tapping as the needles threaded cotton through fabric. Although it was fall, the stench of sweat, filthy bodies, and poor working conditions hung in the air. The look of despair was shared amongst the workers as they barely looked up at his question. "Which Maria?" a woman asked, sitting at the end of one line. "The one that wants a baby," Matthew all but shouted. This was not a place he wanted to be, and the sooner he managed to leave without the child, the better. "Oh, that Maria, she's on the cutting stations today. You'll find her in the back," the woman said before she continued to sew, making it clear she was done talking. Matthew cursed under his breath as the baby fussed in his arms. How people could actually want babies was beyond him. To him, they were nothing more than a nuisance and a drain on finances and energy. He recognized the woman standing over a long table with a pair of scissors in her hands. "Maria?" She looked up, her eyes softening at the bundle in his arms. "You bring baby?" she asked with a heavy Spanish accent. Matthew didn't care where she was from, whether or not her English was broken or what her living conditions might be. All he cared about was that after asking the right people the right questions, he'd managed to find someone who wanted a baby without the necessary paperwork. The arrangement suited him perfectly. There would be no record of him fathering a child, no record of him getting rid of it, and for his silence, he only had to pay her a measly fee to say she found it on the street. "Yes, here, take it." "Boy or girl?" Maria asked, rushing to his side. She looked to be in her late 20s, although her eyes held the trouble and hardship of a woman double her age. "It's a boy. Just take it," Matthew said, shoving the baby into her arms. "He was born a few hours ago. You'll need to feed him." Maria nodded as tears filled her eyes. "He's a beautiful boy." "You've never seen me and you picked this baby up on the street," Matthew said, handing her the money. Maria nodded. "Yes, si, Senor. Just like you say. I'll call him David." Maria accepted the pouch of coins and tucked it into her pocket. "Good. Don't ever come looking for me or its mother. It's yours now. If you go back on this arrangement, I'll make sure you regret it," Matthew said with steel in his voice and a threat in his eyes. Maria took a step back and shielded the child as if he could hear every word. "See, just one more thing, Senor. Is the mother happy with the arrangement?" "Relieved. That's what she is," Matthew said impatiently as he turned and walked back through the factory. It felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. This pregnancy had haunted him for the last 7 months. At first, he had believed just to walk away would be the right thing to do, but it hadn't been that easy. Soon, questions were asked about Mabel's absence at parties. Matthew had tried to explain it away until his biggest client had asked him directly whether or not he was still engaged to Mabel Brown. When Matthew had hesitated, his client had quickly reminded him that Mabel came with a healthy dowry, one that would come in handy for Matthew for many years to come. Matthew didn't argue, especially given his substantial gambling debts. He had crawled back with a plan for Mabel to give up the baby and to pretend it died at birth. It was the perfect plan to set him free again. Of course, he had made sure that she had nothing to her name by the time the baby was expected. The poor fool didn't even know that as of next week, she wouldn't even have a house. He had used her money to invest in a few opportunities he hoped would pay off in the future. He had used it to pay Maria for her silence. He had wagered her house against his gambling debts. Now he just had one more thing to do, and then he was free to live his life again. The life of a free man. Matthew glanced left and right before he walked out of the factory, making sure that no one saw him leave. He was almost back to restoring his reputation. If one person from society saw him now, it would raise all kinds of questions. Why he was on the wrong side of town, why he had walked in with a child and come out without it. More importantly, he would be asked when he would marry Mabel. Right now, he needed to lie low and make sure everyone believed him when he surfaced in a few days and explained that he was mourning the death of his child and the end of his relationship with Mabel. He had the whole story perfectly planned. He would tell them that he simply couldn't stand seeing Mabel, as she was a constant reminder of the child they had lost. It would gain him sympathy. It would gain him respect for staying by her side. It would reinstate his reputation in a town where reputation mattered more than address or heritage. Matthew wanted to pat himself on the back for how cunningly he had reacted to this problem. He had kept up appearances, kept Mabel under his thumb, and now all that was left to be done was to cut her free as well. Chapter 8. Boston, September 1883. Mabel lay in bed curled on her side, feeling empty, hollow, and alone. Although the housekeeper came to check on her every couple of hours, she had never felt more alone. Just yesterday, she had shared her body and her heartbeat with a little baby boy, and now she didn't even know where he was. A tear slipped over her cheek, but she quickly brushed it away. She shouldn't cry. She should thank the Lord that Matthew had found him a good home, a home where he would be loved and not raised in shame, a home where his mother wasn't a fool and his father wasn't afraid of loving him. Another tear slipped onto the pillow as she began to think of her future. If Matthew didn't want children, did that mean that she would never be a mother? Had she just given away her only chance at being a mother? "Miss Brown, Mrs. Smith is here to see you." The housekeeper's voice came softly from the doorway. Mabel cleared her throat as she sat up in bed. She hadn't expected him to return today. He had been there last night when her son was born and had come early this morning to take him to his new family. Mabel had thought he would only return to check on her tomorrow. Although they might share a child, it wasn't appropriate for him to enter her sleeping quarters. She arranged the pillows and pulled up the covers, her body still protesting with the pain of giving birth. "Mabel?" Matthew said quietly as he entered the room. His smile wasn't right, she thought as he took a seat on the furthest edge of the bed. "You're looking much better," Mabel frowned. "Better? I haven't brushed my hair or even slept. I feel terrible. How is he?" she asked, eager to know that her boy was happy in his new home. "He is just perfect. The family adores him. They've decorated a nursery with a brass cot and beautiful drapes, knitted blankets, toys, and bottles, and even his own nanny. He'll be loved and cared for. He'll have a privileged life, Mabel, just like he deserves." Mabel nodded, drawing in a deep breath. "I feel better knowing that. I feel better knowing that he's with a good family, although I miss him." Her voice broke, and she quickly brushed away a tear. "You hardly knew him?" Matthew asked, confused. "Perhaps, but we shared the same oxygen, the same blood. You won't understand." Mabel finally gave up. If there was one thing she had learned about Matthew, it was that he could be heartless when he wanted to. "No, I won't. That's why I've been thinking. Mabel, I don't think it's a good idea for us to be married," Matthew said heavily. Mabel gasped with horror. "But you said if I gave up the baby." "I know what I said, but circumstances have changed. They've changed significantly. Mabel, what I'm trying to say is that we are two very different people. I look at life with narrowed eyes, finding my opportunities. You look at life through rose-colored glasses, expecting everything to come to you. It's not your fault, I will admit, but your parents. They raised you too sheltered from the world." Matthew continued without even giving Mabel a chance to argue. "You expect love and family, and all I want is company when I have the time." It's best if our road ends here. I'll make sure to explain to our friends that the death of our baby struck too hard on our relationship. They'll understand. It's happened before. Mabel shook her head. So that's that? You're just walking away after making me give up everything? I'll walk away, Matthew, since I've seen the type of man you are, but I'm taking my house and my money with me. You can look for another opportunity elsewhere. Matthew shook his head with a sigh. I don't know how to tell you this. You were with child and I didn't want to upset you, but the money, with the property taxes going up and the housekeeper demanding a higher wage, the clothes you needed for the pregnancy, Mabel, there is barely any money left. What? Mabel exclaimed, horrified. It can't be. I had more than enough. Yes, you did, but you were irresponsible with your expenses. It wasn't my place to rein you in. Here's the letter from your lawyer I received last week. Mabel read the words and her heart froze. They're foreclosing on the house? I'm afraid they are. I managed to put them off for another week, but after that, I'm sorry, Mabel, but you'll need to find a new place to live. How can you keep this from me? Mabel demanded, flinching at the movement. I was protecting your child, just like I did when I took him to live with his new family. You don't even have a home for him and not even $1 to your name. I had to keep this from you, or you would have been homeless and penniless with a child to care for. I did the only thing I could think to do. You lied. You lied again. Get out. Get out of my house, out of my life, and don't ever come crawling back again, Mabel cried out as tears streamed over her cheeks. Matthew didn't argue. He turned and left, leaving Mabel sobbing on the bed. Her brief affair with Matthew Smith hadn't cost her only the house, her money, and her housekeeper, but also cost her flesh and blood. Later, she might be grateful that at least her child didn't have to endure the mess she had caused, but right now she was too angry at herself to even consider forgiving herself for being so naive. Chapter 9. Boston, January 1884. You look haggard. I'm sorry, I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just you looked exhausted and dirty. Anna gave an apologetic smile as Mabel set down her purse. Don't apologize. I know exactly what I look like. I look like I've been covered with sawdust, swinging a dirty mop around all day, trying to fend off over-eager men at the docks. Mabel let out a heavy sigh. Anna, I'm not sure how much longer I can do this. The wages are meager, the work is dangerous, and I can't even afford an apartment of my own, much less food or new clothes. Anna shook her head as she moved towards Mabel. Regardless of her exquisite new dress or the dirt covering her friend, she wrapped her arms around her and held her tight. It will get better, Mabel. I promise it will. Mabel didn't want to cry. Heaven alone knew how many tears she had cried over her fate over the last year. She had cried over Matthew's betrayal. She had cried over her little baby now living with strangers. And she had cried because she had to look her friend in the eye and admit that she had nowhere to turn. Anna and her family had been kind enough to take her in, but Mabel knew she couldn't rely on their kindness forever. Although her reputation hadn't been harmed by her pregnancy or her broken engagement to Matthew, everyone knew that she was destitute. She no longer received invitations to dinner parties or dances. Gone were the curious glances from men of means, replaced instead by glances of pity. There were no more tears to cry, except for the tears she cried late at night when Anna was asleep. She sighed as she held her friend, wishing that she had listened all those months ago when Anna had warned her against Matthew. I think God forgot about me. Why else would I find myself in such a situation? She stepped back and searched Anna's gaze. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I don't think you'll ever realize just how sorry I am. Hush, you were in love and thought he would marry you. There's nothing to apologize for. Matthew Smith is a philanderer who saw an opportunity with your inheritance, and that is all there is to it. God didn't forget about you, sweet angel. He knows exactly where you are, and right now, he's rearranging your fate so that you have a future so wonderful you can't even imagine it. You're a good friend, Anna, but I can't believe that my future will ever be so wonderful. I mean, look at me. Who will even look at me now? I've birthed a child. I'm no longer innocent. Besides, I can see the way your mother looks at me over dinner. She's ashamed to have me at your table. I work as a cleaning lady at the docks, for heaven's sake. I can't even blame her, Mabel said with a cynical laugh. Mother adores you, always has. You're imagining it. Mabel went to the washstand in the corner to wash her face. It didn't matter what Anna said to be kind and to make her feel welcome. Mabel knew disgust and disdain when she saw it. She dried her face and turned to Anna with a bright smile. Enough of that. How was your day? Anna blushed bright pink. Rudolph came by to visit. He's asked me for my hand. Of course, I said no. I can hardly marry now. I need to be here for you. Mabel took a moment to process her friend's words. You turned down a proposal from the man you love, a genuinely kind gentleman, to take care of me. Anna, how could you? Anna shrugged as if she had turned down a walk in the park. Because I love him, and he loves me, and I know there will be time for us to get married. Right now, my friend needs me. I've known you longer. Mabel sighed. You're a good friend, Anna, but you must accept I can make other arrangements. I just need a sign, Anna said, scurrying to her writing desk. I've been praying for a sign from God on how to help you, and I came across it this morning. Anna walked back to Mabel with a newspaper in her hand. I found it in the kitchen this morning. One of the maids told me about it. Men in the West that are desperate for wives since there are hardly any proper women out there place advertisements here for women that are eager to find love and happiness in the West. In the West? Mabel asked, surprised. Anna, surely you can't imagine me riding horses and sleeping under the stars on the range? Besides, what man would want a woman like me that has nothing to offer? Anna smiled as she opened the newspaper. Most of them. I've circled a few I thought you might like, especially those with children. We don't want another Matthew in your life. Besides, the men I circled are either widowers that have lost their wives, or men that were jilted because their wives couldn't face the challenges that come with living on the prairie. I'm sorry for the widowers, unless their wives were bitten by snakes or mauled by bears. But honestly, I can't blame the woman for escaping a life in the West. Between the uprisings and dangerous highwaymen, it's hardly a place to build a life, Mabel argued, as she added rouge to her cheeks, hoping Anna's mother wouldn't grimace at the sight of her tonight. Mabel, you're wrong. The way these men describe the West sounds wonderful, in fact. I'm sure there are challenges, but here, listen to this one. Handsome rancher from Idaho seeking companionship, motherly types preferable. Joe Vallance is a cattle rancher with a spread large enough in which to change your mind thrice a day. Widowed, he has been left to care for his little girl Rose, 4 years old, all by himself. Although Joe is a little doubtful that he'll find true love again, he is eager to find companionship. He describes himself as kind, hard-working, not easily angered, and although not wealthy, well able to provide for a wife. He hopes to find someone who can be a mother to his daughter and be a helping hand around the home. If you think that Joe Vallance sounds like the type of man with whom you could spend your life, don't hesitate to write to him. Although Joe isn't looking for love, we hope he might just find it with a woman reading this advertisement. Could it be you? You have to admit, he sounds wonderful, Anna sighed. Mabel took the newspaper from Anna without saying a word and read the advertisement again. She would never have even considered marrying a man she didn't know. But after another 12-hour shift as a cleaner at the shipping offices, anything sounded better than spending the rest of her life on the docks. She thought about the little girl and how hard it must be for her to live on a ranch without a mother. Her motherly instincts awoke, and suddenly Mabel found herself eager to care for the little girl. She understood that Joe wasn't looking for love, and neither was she. It wouldn't be a love match or even a match made in heaven. But perhaps Joe could provide her room and board, and, in exchange, she could be a mother to his daughter and give him the company he sought. And, are you going to write to him? Anna asked, eager for an answer. Mabel looked up and smiled at her friend with a curious look. I'll write to the rancher in Utah if you tell your beau you'll accept his proposal. Anna opened her mouth to argue, and Mabel began to laugh. Tell your mother I won't be down for dinner. I've got a letter to write. She might even be relieved. Anna found stationery and a pen and handed them to Mabel. Don't forget to tell him how wonderful you are. And if Mother seems relieved that you aren't there, I will make sure to give her something to complain about." Anna laughed. "Good luck, Mabel." Left alone with a blank sheet of paper and Joe Valance's advertisement, Mabel took a moment before she began to write. Chapter 10, Utah, April 1884. "You look as if you just received good news," Soaring Eagle said as he returned from the barn. "Pick up a letter in town?" Joe glanced towards the envelope lying on the kitchen table. "I might have." "Your mystery woman from Boston?" Eagle asked, sitting down beside Rosie, who was playing with her doll. "Or one of the others?" Joe shook his head as he poured a cup of coffee for his friend. "I haven't replied to any of the others. Only her. Every time." He sipped on the coffee, wondering why it tasted sweeter when he just thought about Mabel. "If it's only her, then what are you waiting for? Invite her to Utah. That's the only way we'll know if she's the right one. Right, Rosie?" Eagle asked the little girl. Rosie nodded with an eager smile. "Is she the woman that's going to be my new ma?" Joe almost spat his coffee all over the table. "What?" She was going that on about you writing letters the whole time, and I told her you're searching for a new ma for her. "It's the truth, ain't it?" Eagle said with a shrug. Joe sighed, shaking his head. "Sometimes I feel like you're her father and I only have certain privileges." "Don't you think that's something I should have discussed with my daughter?" he asked, a little sharper than intended. Eagle stood up and met his gaze evenly. "Yes, I do. But you didn't, so I did. I wasn't going to lie to little Rosie. Besides, you like this woman, so what's the harm in telling Rosie about her? Unless you're afraid. Afraid of taking a leap. Afraid of falling if you do. If you keep on being frightened your whole life, you'll never know if you can fly." With that, Eagle turned and walked towards the door. "Where are you going? It's almost supper time," Joe asked, hating that his friend was right. "Lost my appetite. Why don't you discuss those certain matters with your daughter?" Eagle said before he slammed the door on his way out. "You made him angry," Rosie said with a pout. "Now he's going to go to bed hungry." Joe sighed, shaking his head. "I'll take him some food when he's cooled down." "Are we going to discuss my new ma?" Rosie asked with a cocked brow, folding her arms as if she was already a young lady. Joe's heart almost ached at how much she reminded him of Elizabeth at that moment. "What do you want to discuss?" Joe asked, knowing he wasn't going to get out without giving her the opportunity to raise her concerns, although she was just 4 years old. "Is she pretty?" Rosie asked seriously. "I don't know. She hasn't sent me a photo of herself. I don't care if she's pretty. I care if she's kind and friendly," Joe explained patiently. "I agree. Does she want to be my ma?" Rosie fired the next question. "She says she loves children and always asks about you when she writes." Joe moved to the table and took a seat beside his daughter. "She won't ever replace your ma, honey. It's just, I think we need a woman around here to teach you woman things." Rosie nodded as if she agreed. "Do you like her?" Joe wasn't sure what he should say, but the fact that he looked forward to her letters and thought of her a few times a day was probably an answer. "Yes, I do. She seems very nice. She's had a hard run of it and works as a cleaner on the docks." "Docks? What's that?" "It's where they build boats and where boats come to bring things from other countries. It's hard work." "Then she'll fit right in. You always say as long as someone is a hard worker and you like them, they'll be an ass to the ranch," Rosie said firmly. Joe had to bite his lip from laughing. "An asset to the ranch, Rosie. An ass is a donkey." "Fine. Prosody, are you going to ask her to come then?" Rosie continued without pause. Joe thought for a long moment, trying to decide if the time was right. He had been writing to Mabel for going on 3 months now. 3 months of learning more about her and her past, 3 months of driving to town to get her letters, only to write back about his life, his daughter, and his friend and ranch hand Eagle. She knew what she could expect if she came west. She also knew that he wasn't flush and couldn't give her the comfort or amenities she was accustomed to in Boston. Perhaps Rosie was right. He'd spent enough time getting to know Mabel through letters. It was time to ask her to be his wife, his companion, and a mother to his daughter. "I think I'm going to do just that." "Will you get married?" Rosie asked, scrunching up her nose. Will it bother you if we did? Joe asked carefully. No, I just want to be at the wedding. Maybe I can wear a new dress, Rose asked hopefully. Joe ruffled his daughter's hair as his heart lightened with relief. If he had Eagle pushing him to propose, Rosie begging him to send for Mabel, and his own heart eager to meet her, then why postpone for another minute? Why don't you go call Eagle to come and help with supper so I can write that letter? Joe asked with a smile. Rosie hopped off her chair and was out the door before he could even get an answer. Chapter 11. Utah, May 1884. My dearest Mabel, I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirit. I realized tonight, after being reminded by Rosie and Eagle, that we have been writing to each other for going on 3 months now. 3 months, during which I've looked forward to your letters every time. I've enjoyed learning about your life in Boston, and I've come to enjoy imagining what your voice sounds like whenever I read your words. I never thought one could find joy in the words of another, especially someone you didn't know, but I do find joy whenever I hear from you. I'm not sure if I've told you, but Rosie isn't my daughter by blood. Although this makes no difference to me, I feel that you should know the truth before reading further. My wife Elizabeth and I were never blessed with children of our own. Although we desperately wanted children, it just never happened. We adopted Rosie from a nearby orphanage, and I have never regretted it. She is my child in every which way that counts, and I hope that if you accept my proposal, you will feel the same. Tonight before dinner, she asked me about you. She asked me if I liked you and why I insisted on writing to you if I could just ask you to come and stay. For a moment, I was shocked and speechless, until I realized Rosie, at the ripe age of 4, was right. I have no interest in answering letters from other women or even continuing with my advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Before I wrote this letter, I wrote a detraction to the editor. So it is with all my heart that I make the following proposal. Mabel, I might not be able to offer you comfort and indoor plumbing that is all the rage now in the East. I might not be able to clothe you in furs and delicate silks. I might not be able to fall in love with you as I did with Elizabeth. But if you agree to be my wife, I can promise you all of the following. I can promise to cherish and protect you until the end of our days. I can promise to be your constant companion in health and sickness. I can promise that you will never go to bed hungry, that you will always have a home with me, and that one day I might be able to afford that fancy indoor plumbing. I can promise you that I will share my daughter with you, that I will not interfere when you discipline her, and that I will support you in every way I can. I can promise that I will never abandon you as your fiancé did, and that I won't gamble and drink in excess. I humbly ask you, Mabel Brown, if you would be my wife. Would you travel west and leave your world, your family, and your memories behind to build a new life and create new memories with us? Will you let Rosie and me be your family, and perhaps in time, we might even be blessed with more children? I ask this not only on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of Rosie. If it is your choice to accept, I've enclosed a postal order that will cover your train fare to Utah, as well as enough money for incidentals, and to send me a wire of when we can expect to collect you from the station. If you do decline, then I understand that this will be my last letter to you. If that is the case, you should know that I will keep you in my prayers and wish you only the best for the future. I hope you find relief from your circumstances, happiness in family, and that someday a man will appreciate you for the kind and generous woman I've come to know over these last few months. P.S. I sincerely hope you do accept. Yours truly, Joe Vallance. Mabel couldn't stop the smile from spreading on her face as she read the words. Although Joe was a man from the West, it was clear he had a mother who had paid attention to his education. The words he had used not only made her heart melt, but made tears of joy shine in her eyes. Until now, she had eagerly read all his letters and learned more about his life and his daughter. Secretly, she had been waiting for a proposal to arrive, but she had never imagined it to be so eloquent or so heartfelt. Her heart skipped a beat at the thought of becoming a mother before it grew heavy and sank to the pit of her stomach. She was a mother, she reminded herself. a mother to a boy who now lived with another family. What if her son had lost his new mother as well? What if he was now also left to a father seeking another wife? She pushed the thoughts aside, the idea too bitter to even entertain. Instead, she closed her eyes and imagined him happy and loved. She imagined him content and cared for. That was the one thing she believed Matthew had done right. He might have done plenty wrong. He might have lied about her finances. He might have gambled away her home, but he had been right about giving up her baby. Mabel couldn't imagine what she would have done to care for him now that she could hardly care for herself. She brushed away a tear at the thought and glanced at the letter again when the door opened and Anna stepped inside. "Mabel, what's the matter?" Anna asked, rushing to her side. She had joined her beau for a dinner party, and of course Mabel hadn't been invited. I think I'm getting married," Mabel all but sobbed. Anna laughed and rushed to her friend, taking the letter from her hands. Her dreamy sigh as she met Mabel's gaze when she was done said it all. "I would have married him as well if he had asked me like that. So go on. Are you going to write to him?" Mabel shook her head, holding up the postal order. "I'm going to wire him before I board the train in the morning. My new life waits in the West, Anna. It's time for me to say goodbye to the hard lessons of the past and to try to forgive myself." Anna smiled sadly. "You did what you thought was right. No one could ever blame you for that. Come on, I'll help you pack." Chapter 12. Utah, May 1884. The train journey had been long, but as they crossed into Utah territory, Mabel had known it was worth it. She had seen the country curve and fall, different landscapes and different towns, and finally she understood the appeal of the wide-open plains. Here the ground wasn't black with muck and dirt. There were no brownstones or even docks, but horses, cattle, and people that had withstood the elements and dangers of the West. As she stepped off the train, she glanced around hoping Joe and his daughter would be there to meet her. She couldn't remember the name of the town in which she had arrived, but she did remember that Joe's daughter was named Rosie. What was her little boy named? She pushed the thought aside as she accepted her large trunk. The platform was barely a tenth of the size of the large platform in Boston, without even a roof to shade against the sun. Mabel adjusted her hand to shield her eyes as she scanned the people on the platform. She didn't even know what her new husband looked like. She realized with unease. "Are you my new ma?" a small voice asked behind her. Mabel turned and couldn't stop the smile that spread on her face at the sight of the little girl. Wild, untamed curls framed her face, her eyes bright with a smile as she waited for Mabel to answer. "That depends," Mabel said, pretending to think. "Is your name Jasmine? Or no, wait, it's Tulip. No, it's not that either. Wait, I've got it. Your name is Daffodil." The little girl all but squealed with laughter. "It's Rosie. Pa says these are for you. I had to hold them just like that all the way on the wagon. Can you take them now? My hand hurts." Mabel laughed. "Thank you very much, Rosie. That's a beautiful name, especially with your rosy cheeks." Rosie smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "I'll go call Pa. He told me to wait by the wagon while he asked Dickie where you were. But he wasn't looking right. I saw you straight away." Mabel was already enchanted by the little girl. Her heart soared knowing that she could be a mother to an adorable little girl like Rosie. She watched as Rosie raced across the platform to a tall man standing with his back to her. He bent to scoop his daughter up before he turned. Across the platform, their eyes met, and Mabel was surprised to feel her knees tremble for a second before her heart began to race. Joe Vallance wasn't just a father, a widower, and a rancher. He was the most handsome man Mabel had ever laid eyes on. Her breath caught when he smiled at her, making Mabel wonder how she was going to manage to speak when he had closed the distance between them. His hair was dark, just like his daughter's, his eyes guarded by thick brows. His skin was tanned and his shoulders broad. He had the gait of a man who either had all the time in the world or was comfortable enough to take his time. As he moved closer, she could see that his muscles were honed, giving him a rangy build that oozed with strength. Although Matthew had been a handsome man, he was soft in a certain way. There was nothing soft about Joe Vallance, except his eyes. Mabel, Rosie informs me that she found you before I did. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Joe said, setting down his daughter. Mabel offered her hand, and instead of shaking it, Joe surprised her by brushing a kiss over her knuckles. Charmed. Are we going to get this wedding going, or are you two going to stand here gawking at each other all day? A man asked, moving up behind Joe. He held out his hand, and for a moment, Mabel wasn't sure if he was friend or foe. Clearly, Joe quickly picked up on her hesitance. Soaring Eagle, meet Mabel Brown. Oh, I thought Eagle was a nickname, Mabel quickly explained. I apologize for my hesitance. It's a pleasure to meet you, Eagle. I've heard wonderful things about you. All true, Eagle said proudly. We haven't heard much, I'll be honest, but we have seen this man smile quite a lot since he heard you were coming. Joe chuckled a little nervously. I hope you don't mind, but I asked the preacher if he'd wed us on your arrival. Thought it might be best since you'll be living on the ranch. It is quite a distance from town. Mabel glanced down at her dress. She wasn't dressed for a wedding. Pa bought you a dress. You can change at the dress shop. He bought me one as well, Rosie quickly said, looking up at her father. Right, Pa? Joe nodded. I wasn't sure about the size, but the lady said they can make it work. You don't have to if it's too soon. Mabel felt a calmness settle over her heart at his thoughtfulness. This man was nothing like Matthew Smith. Not only did he consider her, he even asked her opinion. She thought about his proposal and how kind and honest he'd been as she looked down at Rosie's waiting smile. Of course, it's perfect. I'll need a little time to freshen up after the journey, though. Come on, let's you and me walk ahead, Eagle said, taking Rosie's hand and leading her towards the thoroughfare. Mabel knew it was to give them a little privacy. As soon as they were out of earshot, Joe let out a quiet sigh. I'm sorry. I probably ain't doing none of this right. I have no idea what's expected or how to do this. Mind giving me some advice? Mabel laughed easily as she shook her head. I think you're doing just fine. The sermon was short, the drive back to the ranch long. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun was setting in the west. Rosie had entertained her with stories about the ranch and what to expect all through the trip homeward. But nothing Rosie had told her could have prepared her for the beautiful cabin that she saw standing under a hill. Mabel glanced at Joe and was rewarded with a handsome smile from her new husband. He'd already explained that she would have her own room until the time came she chose otherwise. Welcome home, Joe said with a smile. Even before the wagon stopped, Mabel knew she had finally found the home she hadn't even been aware she had been looking for. She might not be in love with Joe, but there was a connection she didn't understand. Rosie had already stolen her heart, and as for Eagle, she now knew not to fear him, and instead appreciated his calm presence. Home, Mabel said when the wagon stopped. That's exactly what it feels like already. Chapter 13. Utah, July 1884. Joe hadn't been sure what to expect when Mabel had arrived more than 6 weeks ago, but he didn't expect to feel his heart expanding with love. He didn't expect to seek her out when he returned from the range, and he didn't expect to want more than just her companionship. She had turned his cabin into a home again, for the first time since Elizabeth had been buried. She had brought warmth, love, and laughter back into his life. Apart from feeling himself come to life again after 2 years of all but hiding from it, the most rewarding part was seeing Rosie blossom beneath Mabel's attention. Finally, his daughter was doing something other than trailing after him and Eagle all day. She was helping with laundry, learning to cook, and to his surprise, learning to write. Mabel was the perfect choice for a mother for Rosie. Although he still missed Elizabeth, Joe had finally come to understand that a ghost can't bring warmth or love to a child. A real mother like Mabel could. He never expected that he would fall in love ever again, but the more time he spent with Mabel, the more Joe knew that was exactly what had happened. He had been privileged enough to experience love before and could now recognize it without a doubt. More than once he had considered telling Mabel how he felt, but something was holding him back. He wasn't sure if it was the grief that still lurked in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, or if it was the instinctual fear that he was replacing Elizabeth. If you keep looking at her, she might break, Eagle teased on the mount beside him. Joe shook his head, abruptly brought back to the present. She's tougher than she looks. And you feel more for her than you admit. You gonna tell her? Eagle asked, chewing on a piece of long grass. We're done moving the cattle. I only stopped 'cause you stopped. If I knew you were stopping to ogle your new bride, I would have been saddled off by now. Joe chuckled. You stopped because you like looking inside another man's head. No need to look, it's written all over your face. I'll take Rosie for a swim by the creek. You spend some time with your bride, Eagle called out as he rode towards the cabin. Joe watched as Eagle scooped Rosie up by the arm before settling her in the saddle in front of him. Rosie waved with laughter to Mabel as she and Eagle raced off towards the creek. Knowing that the time had come to tell Mabel how he felt, he kicked his horse into a gallop towards his new bride. On his approach, Mabel threw her hands up in the air with laughter. If you think you can just swing me on too. Her laughter grew louder as Joe grabbed her arm and swung onto the saddle behind him. Onto my saddle? Joe asked with a smile as he headed for the top of the hill. Joe Vallance, has the sun fried your brain? Mabel asked, grabbing hold of his waist as the horse headed up the hill. Nope, just realized I've never taken you on a ride before, Joe said, enjoying the way her hands held him. For a moment, he wondered if he should stop or just keep on riding. When the engraved tombstone came into view, he remembered the reason for bringing Mabel here. He slowed the horse to a walk and stopped beneath the old tree. Without a word, he slid out of the saddle before helping Mabel down. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, Joe knew she felt the same, knew that she too hadn't expected the strong tug of their hearts. The view from here is beautiful. Oh, look, there's Eagle and Rosie. Mabel laughed, pointing towards the creek. Yeah, Joe said quietly. That's why we chose this spot for her. Mabel turned and noticed the tombstone. Her laughter faded, her eyes softened. Elizabeth? Joe nodded. Yes, plus 7%. I wasn't sure if I ever wanted the two of you to meet, but since you're sharing our daughter, I thought it was only right, Joe said, quickly amending his words. He wanted to say both women shared his heart, but at the last minute, he wasn't sure Mabel was ready for a declaration of love. Mabel sighed as she looked at the tombstone. I wish I could have met her. Rosie's such a wonderful child, and she played such a big part in that. And she'll become even more wonderful with your influence. She adores you, Mabel, Joe said quietly, moving towards her. You're a wonderful mother. Mabel's eyes flew up to meet his. You don't know what you're talking about. Her gaze had darkened, her eyes soulless and filled with grief. I do. I see the way you treat her, the way you discipline her with kindness. I can recognize a good mother when I see one, a good woman. Mabel shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. Joe, I have to get back. I've got biscuits in the oven. Before Joe could tell her to let the biscuits burn, Mabel had begun running down the hill. For a moment, he was flabbergasted, wondering what he had done wrong. 1 second, he was about to tell her he loved her, and the next, she all but brushed him off and had run away from him. He turned to Elizabeth's grave and let out a heavy sigh. I need your help, Lizzie. I'm no good at this. I love her, and I know you would approve. But how can I make her see that? Just then, a leaf tugged free, regardless that it wasn't yet fall, and floated down towards the cabin on the breeze. A smile curved Joe's mouth, knowing that his wife was giving him a sign. To follow Mabel, to support her, to trust her, and to be patient. Because love floats with the breeze and doesn't stand against it like a dead tree. Chapter 14, Utah, July 1884. It can't be. You must have made a mistake, Matthew cried out in anger. No mistakes, Mr. Smith, I assure you, the lawyer said calmly. He didn't like Matthew and secretly found pleasure in being the one to give him such bad news. But I brought her to you. She signed the papers. You have the papers that she signed giving me rights to her inheritance, Matthew argued as he began to pace the lawyer's office. The lawyer shrugged. Mr. Smith, I only do what my clients ask me to do. You and Miss Brown asked me to draw up papers to give you access to her inheritance, in other words, her liquid assets. You never requested me to carry over the deed of the house to your name. If you had, the deed would have been in your name. But but that's what I meant. I am going to make sure you never have another client in Boston ever again. You delinquent, incapable fool. Matthew's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, but behind his anger was fear. The cold type of fear that clung to the spine, squeezing every ounce of energy with every breath drawn. I assure you, Mr. Smith, my clients are always very clear in what they expect of me. I've never had a complaint. Given that you and Miss Brown never married, I assure you they will agree with me that your request to have the deed now carried onto your name is questionable. Might I ask why you need the deed to the brownstone so urgently? The lawyer asked over his half-moon spectacles. From what I understand, Miss Brown hasn't lived there for quite some time. A year, if I'm correct. Last I heard, she wasn't even in town. Matthew's fists clenched at his sides. What do you mean by the last you heard? Of course she's in town. Find her and make her sign the deed over to me. She doesn't have to know what it is. My duties do not include finding people who have left the state, Mr. Smith. I have more important matters to concern myself with. I personally tried to contact her a few months ago when you first requested the deed and was informed that she was no longer in Boston. The lawyer closed the leather flap on the file with a loud thwack before he stood up. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have clients who actually own the properties they want to mortgage. His voice was as chilly as an Arctic breeze in the middle of winter, making the cold on Matthew's spine almost freeze over. Fine, but this isn't the end. I'll find her and drag her to you if that's what it takes. But that brownstone belongs to me, Matthew shouted as he opened the door, making sure everyone in the vicinity heard. A few brows were raised as he exited the lawyer's office, and one woman actually shielded her child from the angry man. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, Matthew groaned with displeasure. When he had told Mabel that she had nothing left months ago, he had been certain matters had been finalized. But after months of getting threats from the gambling house he owed, he had finally come to see the lawyer to hasten the transfer of the property. Matthew had believed it to be a miscommunication, a simple misunderstanding. Never in a million years did he imagine that the brownstone still belonged to Mabel. Now he had the Boston gamblers refusing him entry to any establishment in town, whispers following him everywhere he went about his debts, and a threat on his life was just waiting to be executed. The only way out of the mess was to find Mabel, and to find her soon. He thought for a few moments before knowing where he would get the answers he needed. Instead of heading back to his own home or office, Matthew turned and walked to the Stone residence on the other side of town. Matthew had never cared for Anna Stone, especially since her wedding to a wealthy banker in town, but today he would pretend to be her best friend. And if that didn't work, he would need to use the dagger he carried around for show. He didn't care what it took or how he did it, but he would find Mabel. If Anna chose to keep her silence, then she'd take her silence to her grave. Chapter 15. Utah, August 1884. When Mabel had stepped off the train that very first day, she had truly believed that she might just find love instead of just a marriage of convenience. Those first few weeks had made her hopes soar even higher. She wasn't just in love with Rosie's quirky personality and bold outlook on life. She was captivated and enchanted by the little girl's father. Joe was a quiet man with firm thoughts on right and wrong, something Mabel appreciated after having a man like Matthew in her life. Over the summer, they had come to enjoy each other's company. At least that was what Mabel had come to believe. She had allowed herself to open her heart, knowing that her future was on this ranch. But now she wondered if it had been the right move. The last time she had opened her heart, it had cost her not only her inheritance but her child as well. A stab of guilt and shame rushed over her at the thought of her son living with someone else. Matthew had ruined her life in Boston and had taken her child from her. A worse fate Mabel could never have imagined. But now, she found herself in an unimaginable situation once again. When was she going to learn that opening her heart only caused her pain? First, she had lost everything to a man who had proved himself a liar and a cheat, and now she had lost her heart to a man who was still in love with a ghost. Mabel had known from his letters how thoroughly he had loved Elizabeth. She had accepted that a marriage of convenience would bring her the joy of being a mother to a little girl. Now Mabel couldn't help but want more. She wanted a real marriage, a real husband, a real family. When Joe had taken her to Elizabeth's grave, she had truly thought that their relationship had been about to change. But when she had heard the way he spoke of Elizabeth, how much he loved her, Mabel had realized that he would never be able to love her in that way. His wife couldn't birth a child, and Mabel had given hers away. If Joe were to learn the truth, he would put her on the next train east faster than he could swing a rope. Over the last 2 weeks, Mabel had kept her distance, knowing that it was only a matter of time before Joe found out. The secret grew heavier with every passing day. It became backbreaking whenever Rosie smiled at her, or she found Joe looking at her with that curious gaze. More than anything, it haunted her dreams. At night, the guilt over keeping her secret from Joe subsided, and she felt like the worst mother alive for giving up her son. She knew that Matthew had promised he would have a better life, but just seeing how much Rosie missed her mother made Mabel wonder if her son even knew she existed. He had only been a few hours old when Matthew had taken him away. Although Mabel doubted he would remember her, Mabel knew she would never be able to make peace with her decision, a decision she had been coerced into by Matthew. "Mabel, did you hear?" Rosie asked, tugging at her dress. Mabel glanced down at the little girl and felt her heart swell with love. If Joe sent her away, she wasn't sure who she would miss more, Rosie or her father. "No, honey, I didn't hear. What was that?" "I asked why you and Pa don't share the same room." Rosie's nose scrunched up with curiosity. Mabel swallowed, not knowing how to answer. It's because I snore worse than a bear in the middle of winter," Joe said, walking into the house. Mabel turned and smiled gratefully at him. His eyes lit up as he smiled at her. Mabel's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment there was hope again, until she felt it crashing to the floor, knowing that it wouldn't last. It couldn't. Joe would never forgive her if he knew the truth. And even if he did, he was still in love with a ghost. There wasn't space in his heart for Mabel while Elizabeth resided there. Chapter 16. Utah, August 1884. A few days later, Mabel was stringing beans in the kitchen and singing her favorite hymn when she saw the wagon arrive. She was about to stop Rosie from rushing outside to welcome the stranger when she remembered that Rosie had asked to help her father and Eagle in the hayloft. Mabel set down the beans and walked to the window with narrowed eyes. The suit and the hat made it clear that the visitor wasn't from around these parts, Mabel thought as she watched him climb out of the wagon. She felt the blood drain from her face when she recognized Matthew's smug grin and thin mustache. For a moment she considered running, but knew that wouldn't solve anything. She needed him to leave before he said something that could cost her the life she was building here. Joe might not love her, but that didn't mean she wanted to leave. Mabel walked out of the house and approached Matthew, grabbing him by the arm before he could even attempt to greet her. "Hush and come with me, or I'll shout and my husband will shoot," Mabel said under her breath. She knew that Joe did have a shotgun somewhere. She just wasn't sure if he'd be willing to use it on a man instead of a wild animal. She kept walking until they were to the side of the cabin, far out of earshot from the barn. When she stopped, she turned and met Matthew's gaze with a cold, hard look of her own. "What are you doing here, Matthew? How did you find me?" Matthew's smile was so sweet, but Mabel knew that sweetness was filled with poison. "How I found you doesn't matter, sweetheart. All that matters is that I did. Oh, how I've missed you." Matthew took a step forward, but Mabel took 2 steps back. "Don't come near me. What are you doing here?" Mabel demanded a little louder. All the anger that had been haunting her rushed to the surface. "I made a mistake, Mabel. I never should have let you go. I didn't realize that until it was too late. I want you back. Come back to Boston with me, please?" Matthew pleaded, taking off his hat. Mabel might have once fallen for his charms and deceit, but she wasn't going to fall for it again. "You want me back? You want me back after you called off our engagement, then reinstated it, and tossed me to the curb after you stole all my money. I don't want you back. What I want is justice for everything you did to me. Justice? For what? I didn't do anything to you. You did it to yourself. I want to make things right between us. I want us to grow old together. Matthew tried again. You could have made it right by marrying me when I was pregnant. You could have made it right by letting me keep my child. You could have made it right by marrying me then. Instead, you ran. I can't trust you, Matthew. I won't ever make that mistake again, Mabel said, biting back the tears at the thought of her son in someone else's arms. I want to make it right now. You have to forgive me. I can't stand the thought of you in another man's arms. You belong to me first. Please, Mabel, forgive me. Matthew turned on the charm as he fell to his knees, all but pleading with her. Mabel shook her head, struggling to understand how she could have fallen for his transparent charm before. No, you need to leave. I never want to see you again. You can't do that, Mabel. You complain about what I did to you. You ruined my reputation. You ruined my entire life, you spoiled little brat. Matthew got to his feet, daggers flashing in his eyes. Everyone feels sorry for poor little Mabel, but no one knows that you seduced me. Mabel wasn't about to get involved in that argument. They were lies. She knew it, and that was all that mattered. You should leave. No, I'm not leaving without you. Is that clear? Matthew's voice lowered to barely more than a whisper, the threat clear with every syllable. You're a horrible man, Matthew. You were a terrible fiancé, and you would have made an even worse husband. I'm grateful I'm rid of you. If my husband finds you here, you'll be in a world of trouble. Mabel felt fear run down her spine. Matthew had never raised a hand to her, but his eyes were no longer soft and charming, but hard and desperate, almost dangerous. What man would want to marry you? You couldn't even get your fiancé to marry you when you fell pregnant. You gave your child away as if he was nothing. You're not even worth the trouble, Matthew said between his teeth. You're nothing but a spoiled, naive, young brat. Mabel couldn't keep quiet anymore. She couldn't stand by and let him cast all the blame on her. She had kept quiet in Boston, but she was done keeping her silence. It was time Matthew learned that he couldn't just walk over her anymore. You made me give up my child. Our child. You told me he would have a better life after you squandered all my money and gambled my home away. You ruined my life. I've just started to build a new one, and I won't let you ruin this as well. Matthew's wry laugh made Mabel cringe in disgust. That child was nothing of mine but trouble waiting to happen. Perhaps it's time you learned more about the wonderful family that adopted him. Matthew took a step closer. Mabel could smell the drink on his breath. I didn't put him up for adoption, you foolish hag. You would have had to sign papers for that. I gave him to an immigrant worker in a factory, a seamstress, worse off than you are. I even paid Maria to keep quiet about where she found him. She was going to tell people she found him abandoned on the street. Mabel felt the blood drain from her face, her knees grow weak, and her vision start to blur. Her worst nightmares couldn't have been crueler. You said. You know what the best part is, Mabel? I used your money to pay for her silence. You didn't just abandon your son, you paid someone to take him. Matthew chuckled, shaking his head. You ignorant fool. Chapter 17. Joe had seen the wagon approach and watched as Mabel all but dragged the man around the house. An uneasiness had washed over him. After asking Eagle to keep Rosie in the barn with him, Joe had followed Mabel and the stranger. He had walked around the back of the house to make sure they didn't see him as he approached. For a moment, Joe had doubted Mabel and had thought she had invited trouble to his ranch. But the moment she said the man's name, he remembered her letters about the fiancé who had stolen all her money and her home and left her penniless. Anger surged through his veins when the man began to threaten Mabel. He was about to interrupt, to support Mabel against a man who was nothing but a bully, when the conversation took an unexpected turn. Mabel had told him about the engagement and about her fiancé, but she had never mentioned a child. For a few moments, Joe was so shocked, he could do nothing but listen to how she had lied to him. He was about to interfere and tell her to leave the ranch immediately when he heard how Matthew had forced her to give up her child. Joe's breath caught as he listened to the lies Matthew had told her, to convince her to give up her baby. If Joe had been angry on the day that he had found Soaring Eagle left for dead on the side of the road, he couldn't even find a word for the way he felt now. His heart ached for Mabel, understanding for the first time why shadows of grief resided in her eyes. He understood now why she had withdrawn after he had taken her to Elizabeth's grave. Joe wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms and to tell her that he understood, that he cared, and that he didn't blame her for being young and naive. One day, his own daughter would be young and naive, and he prayed to God that if the time came, he would be there to protect his daughter against scavengers, the likes of Matthew. Mabel had no one, and instead of being cautious, she had believed Matthew's lies. Joe fisted his hands at his sides as he moved towards them. He had heard enough, and this man had hurt Mabel, his wife, the second love of his life, with his lies and his guilt. He hadn't just cost Mabel her inheritance, but her child as well. Joe felt his blood heat just knowing that he had paid someone to take the baby and had used Mabel's money to do so. "That's enough," Joe heard himself shouting to quiet Matthew's threats. Matthew and Mabel turned to him, both surprised to see him there. Mabel's eyes quickly fell to the ground with shame. Joe couldn't stop himself from going to her. He wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders before he turned to Matthew. "I think it's time you left, sir. This ain't no friendly country to strangers." Joe allowed his western drawl to come on thick as he narrowed his eyes beneath his Stetson. "I'm not leaving without her," Matthew said without any sign of intimidation. Joe chuckled wryly. "That's not going to happen. This here is my wife, and in this state, a man can get a rope around his neck for taking another man's wife." "Joe," Eagle called from behind Matthew before tossing Joe the shotgun. Regardless of its weight and the unexpected move, Joe caught it with one hand, keeping the other around Mabel. "You're trespassing, and I'm completely within my rights to shoot, ain't I, Eagle?" Eagle just laughed, a deep roar behind Matthew. Joe could see the man had realized that he had just met his match. He shrugged as he spoke. "I think it's best if you go now. You don't want my Indian friend here to try scalping again. The last time didn't go so well." Mabel gasped beside him as Matthew's quivering hands reached into the inner pocket of his coat. No, that won't be necessary. You can keep the girl, just let her sign this, and I'll be on my way." Mabel didn't move. "What is it?" "A letter from my lawyer releasing me from your inheritance," Matthew said, attempting a smile, but from where Joe stood, he could read the letters DEED. Without asking, he stepped forward and took it from Matthew. He held it between him and Mabel as he read. "What is this?" Mabel asked him, looking up at him with innocent eyes, clearly overwrought by the situation. Joe shook his head before a wry chuckle escaped him. He handed Mabel the sheet of paper before taking aim with both hands on the firearm. "That, Mabel, is the deed to your brownstone in Boston. Matthew here was about to have you sign it over to him." "But I thought, the bank, it's gone?" Mabel stuttered with confusion. "The bank never wanted it. I used it to pay my gambling debts. I can't unless you sign that sheet of paper." "Please, Mabel, my life is in danger," Matthew pleaded desperately. The charade of chauvinism was gone, the charm non-existent. Mabel shook her head beside Joe. "My son's life is in danger, living with strangers because of you. You made them believe I didn't want my son. You don't deserve my help. I think you had better leave. I've seen my husband shoot, and he doesn't miss." Mabel's voice was low, anger evident. Joe felt a smile curve the corners of his mouth. She had found her anger and found some redemption after all Matthew had done to her. "Go on, git." Matthew hesitated for a moment before he all but ran to his wagon. When he took the reins, he glanced at Mabel again. Joe fired a shot into the air just to make it clear that his shotgun was loaded before the wagon took off, a dust cloud rising from the beating hooves. Once Joe was certain Matthew was good and gone, he tossed the shotgun back to Eagle. "Rosie? Feed in the baby chicks. I'll go check on her." Eagle tipped his hat at Mabel before he headed back to the barn. Joe turned to Mabel, surprised by how strong his feelings were for her. The moment he heard Matthew reveal what he had done, Joe knew that he wouldn't allow anything to ever happen to Mabel. She was his second chance, his life, his wife. Chapter 18. Mabel dropped her head in shame. She had never wanted Joe to learn about the son she had given up. Shame and guilt clogged her throat, tears burning her eyes. She had never been more ashamed in her entire life. To know that what Matthew had done after promising her that he would find her son a good family made her want to scream from the mountaintops with anger. Mabel kicked at the dust, feeling Joe's questioning gaze on her. "I'm sorry I lied. I never meant to. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I don't think even God will ever forgive me." Mabel's voice broke with emotion. She dragged in a ragged breath. "I'll be gone before sunset. Tell Rosie that I loved her as if she were my own." She turned and was about to pack when a firm hand on her shoulder stopped her. Joe turned her to face him, but Mabel didn't dare meet his gaze. She couldn't bear to see the anger and the disappointment there. More than anything, she couldn't bear to see the disgust. His rough, calloused finger reached beneath her chin and tilted her head up to face him. "Where do you think you're going?" Joe asked softly. His gaze held kindness instead of everything Mabel had expected. "I know you won't forgive me for lying. It wasn't right. I don't know where I'll go, but probably back to Boston. At least I have friends there." "Don't worry, I won't expect you to pay the train fare." "Mabel, why do you think I took you to Elizabeth's grave?" Joe asked, surprising Mabel with the unexpected question. Mabel frowned, not really understanding. "What? I guess to make it clear that you'll never love someone the way you loved her. She was a very lucky woman." Joe shook his head as he took a step closer. Mabel felt his warm hands close over hers as he searched her gaze. "I took you there because I only thought it was fair for you to meet. I told you that day it was because you both shared Rosie, but that wasn't the whole truth, Mabel." Joe's mouth curved into a smile. "It's because you both share my heart." Mabel knew the sun was getting to her, either that or the unexpected traumatic visit from Matthew. She shook her head. "What?" "I said it's because you share my heart. Mabel, when I began writing to you, I never expected to fall in love with you. I just wanted someone to be a mother to Rosie, someone who would listen to my nagging and complaining. Then I turned around at the train station and I saw you." Joe's smile broadened. "I knew from that minute that I was in trouble. The way you and Rosie got along, the way you stepped into my house and brought warmth and joy back into it. Mabel, I fell in love with you, unexpectedly and completely." Joe's laughter made Mabel's mouth curve. "What? You love me?" Mabel asked, surprised. "I thought you couldn't fall in love again." "So did I. It turns out I just needed to meet the right woman, the right wife. So you can't leave," Joe said, searching her gaze. "Rosie needs you. The house needs you. I need you. But what about my baby? You heard what I did. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I believed it was the best choice at the time. I believed he would have a better life." Mabel couldn't stop the tears that started to fall. Joe pulled her in and held her close as she sobbed on his shoulder. She cried for the son she had given away, for the mistakes she had made, not knowing how she would ever be able to forgive herself. When the tears slowed, Joe framed her face with his hands. "Mabel, it wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. Men like Matthew. I don't even want to talk about him. Just know this. I don't blame you. I never will." "You're a good man, Joe Vallance," Mabel said, wiping the tears from her eyes. "And I'm your husband, double win for you." Joe offered her a handkerchief. "My son, Joe," Mabel sighed softly. Joe could see the pain and regret in her eyes. He wished he could do something to ease her pain and heartache, but knew that words would not suffice. Instead, he framed her face and smiled into her gaze, a gaze he had come to look forward to seeing every morning. "God will protect him and provide for him, Mabel. I can promise you that. We'll pray for him as often as we can, and we'll never forget him." Although they had just declared their love for each other, Mabel's soft sobs filled the air. Joe pulled her close and held her, knowing that the heartache wouldn't ease within a day or a week, perhaps not even in years. Chapter 19. Utah, August 1884. 3 days after Matthew's unfortunate visit, Mabel woke up in her new room. After she and Joe had shared the truth about their feelings, she had moved into his room. Of course, Rosie had wanted to know if her father had stopped snoring, causing everyone to laugh. The late summer sun shone in through the bedroom window that looked out over the hill on which Elizabeth had been laid to eternal rest. Once, Mabel would have felt uncomfortable at the thought of sleeping in the same room with a man who had once loved another, but now she was grateful for being loved by a wonderful man. She was grateful that Elizabeth had insisted they adopt Rosie, and more than anything, she was grateful that she could share Rosie's future, although Elizabeth held her past. It was as if her life had suddenly turned around. She felt loved, accepted, and cherished. Suddenly, the world was in full color instead of the morbid gray tones Mabel had been living this last year. For a few moments every morning, Mabel was happy, a type of happiness that she had never experienced before, until she remembered Matthew's words. The world quickly faded again, her heart sinking into despair once again. She couldn't stop wondering where he was, who was taking care of him, and what they would one day tell him about his mother. Mabel rolled over into her pillow to cry, not wanting to burden Joe and Rosie with tears they didn't cause. Then something crinkled under her cheek. She sniffed away the tears as she took out the piece of paper. Blinking a few times to clear her eyes of tears and sleep, Mabel read the words. "My dearest Mabel, I've unexpectedly needed to leave on ranch business. I expect to be back within the week, at the most 2. Please take care of Rosie and know that I love you both." Mabel frowned without understanding why Joe would leave without telling her. When she heard Eagle's voice call to Rosie outside, she breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that she wouldn't be alone with a little girl on the ranch in the middle of Utah. Doubt crept up her spine about his sudden absence. Joe had been nothing but loving and kind to her since Matthew left, but now she couldn't help but wonder if he was having second thoughts about letting her stay. She kneeled before her bed and closed her eyes, knowing that only God would have the answers to her questions and the power to protect both her husband and her son. Dear Lord, I know that over the last year my faith has been failing with all the challenges I've had to face. I doubted if you still remembered my name, but after you gave me Joe and Rosie. I know that you see me. I see you now, Lord. I beg you to keep my husband safe, protect my son, and care for him. If Joe has left because he doubts me, or if he has had a change of heart, I will understand. I know that I have done the unforgivable and can't even forgive myself. How can I expect you or Joe to forgive me? All I ask is that you bring him happiness. I don't care what happens to me, Lord, but I care for this family. I care for my son. I beg of you to bring them joy, love, and laughter. And if you are as kind as the Bible says, I hope that one day you can forgive me for giving my son away. Perhaps you might even see fit to grant me a little happiness as well. I'm sorry for lying to Joe, Lord. I was just so afraid that he'd turn me away if I told him the truth. I ask this not because I am deserving, Lord, but because I know that only a powerful and merciful God like you can do the impossible. Amen. Mabel brushed away the tears that had punctuated her prayer, knowing she had repeated herself more than once. She couldn't help but feel that Joe didn't have ranch business. She feared he had gone to the sheriff to report her for abandoning her child. She's 7%. Fear swept through her heart as she washed and dressed. Rosie would have questions, and although Eagle wouldn't ask them, he would have questions in his eyes. She wasn't sure if she could face either of them, but she knew she didn't really have a choice. When she was finished, she went to the kitchen and was grateful to see that Eagle had started a pot of coffee. She had barely poured herself a cup when Rosie rushed into the kitchen. Mabel, Pa had to go away. He said to tell you that he'll be back soon, Rosie said, rushing to Mabel's side. Mabel wasn't sure if she should feel better that he had left her a message or if she should feel worse that he had woken Rosie to say goodbye, but hadn't bothered to wake her. He left me a note, Mabel said a little uneasily as Eagle walked into the kitchen. Rosie, them chickens are still waiting for their feed, Eagle said with a firm look at Rosie. Rosie sighed, but she hurried out of the cabin to the chicken coop. As soon as she was gone, Mabel turned to Eagle. There was no ranch business to attend to, was there? Eagle shook his head. No, ma'am, Rosie nodded. And you're not going to tell me where he went, are you? He asked me not to. Best you can do now is to take care of Rosie and be patient, Eagle said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The trees don't rush the seasons. They wait for each one to bring them new colors. Mabel smiled sadly. I get it. Patience is a virtue and all that. Precisely, Eagle said, holding up his cup. Mabel knew he was trying to be kind, but instead of easing her worry, he had inadvertently made it worse. Because now she knew he had lied and that he left for a reason he didn't want to share with her. A reason that would probably mean the end of her time on the ranch. Chapter 20. Boston, September 1884. Joe stood in front of the factory and let out a heavy sigh. This factory with the rusted facade and sagging windows was his only hope to find Mabel's son. Ever since he had learned what Matthew had done, Joe couldn't put Mabel's son out of his mind. She had traveled all the way west to take his daughter as her own, and yet she hadn't even had the opportunity to be a mother to her own son. He had discussed his idea with Eagle, and although Eagle had agreed that the chances of finding Mabel's son were slim to none, he knew he had to try. He had to at least try to find the little boy who had been abandoned because a man had spun a web of lies and trapped his mother in the middle. The train journey had taken him 4 days. 4 days during which he had thought about nothing but how much he wanted to see Mabel smile without the shadows of grief and guilt in her eyes. He didn't doubt his love for her and didn't doubt her feelings for him, but only a father could understand that Mabel would never be whole without her son. The first 2 days in Boston had been exhausting, walking from business to find out if anyone knew of Matthew Smith. On the evening of the 3rd day, he happened to overhear a conversation in which Smith's name was mentioned. After telling a white lie about wanting to inform him about a hefty inheritance from a distant uncle, he had quickly been told where to find Matthew. Joe had never been an aggressive man. He had never enjoyed arguing, fighting, or violence of any kind. But when Matthew had laughed in his face about never finding Mabel's son, he had seen red. Before he knew it, he had Matthew against the wall, threatening to tear him from limb to limb if he didn't get answers. Matthew couldn't remember the name of the woman or the factory, but he knew it was a factory on the poor side of town. Joe had tried to press him for more, but even after twisting his arm to the point of compromising his ligaments, Matthew had tearfully denied knowing anything more, which left Joe with no option but to seek out every factory in the area that he had mentioned. Joe was tired of Boston. Although he had only been there for 4 days, he missed the ranch. He missed his family, and more than anything, he missed the clean air and wide-open spaces. He glanced at his pocket watch and decided it was late enough to go inside. He had been standing in front of the factory since dawn, hoping that as soon as he found Mabel's son, he could get on a train back to the west. But now, as he approached the side door, he wondered if he would ever find the little boy. By his calculations, Mabel's son would be about 9 months old. He carefully pushed the door open and saw several women turn to look at him. He held up his hands, making it clear that he didn't mean any trouble. He had learned from the previous factories that he had visited that the owners didn't take well to interruptions on their production lines. Joe glanced around for a child, but saw none. He stopped and made eye contact with the women before he began to speak. I just have a question, and then I'll leave. I don't mean to cause no trouble. I'm just searching for a baby boy. A man by the name of Matthew Smith stole a woman's child, told her lies about giving it up for adoption, when instead he gave the baby to a woman in one of the factories around these parts. He paid the woman handsomely to tell everyone she had found the baby abandoned on the road when that isn't what happened at all. The woman shared a few glances before they shrugged as one, clearly not about to tell him anything, even if they did know who he was talking about. Joe let out a sigh and tried one last time. Are any of you mothers? A few women nodded. Then imagine this. Imagine someone taking your child. Imagine someone lying to you about it, only to learn later that you had been tricked and deceived. Can you imagine the guilt, the shame, the nightmares? The woman I love is suffering all that simply because she trusted the wrong man. If you don't know about the little boy that was born in January, or the woman who took him, then fine. But if you do, please come forward. Please tell me where I can find that baby boy so I can reunite him with his mother." Joe was certain nothing would come of his pleas when a woman stood and reached under her work table for a basket. She met his eyes across the room as tears quietly fell over her cheeks. I thought the mother had died. That's the only reason I agreed to take him." Everyone disappeared as Joe moved towards the woman holding the basket. He glanced inside, and there was no mistaking that this child belonged to Mabel. He had her nose, her almond-shaped eyes, and her smile. His heart all but exploded with love, knowing that he would raise this boy as his own son. Chapter 21, Utah, September 1884. "Mabel, come quick! Pa is back!" Rosie cried out as she ran out the doors and onto the porch. Mabel glanced down at the dish in her hand and decided it could wait. She dropped it in the water, dried her hands, and followed Rosie outside. Her heart was fluttering a mile a minute with excitement at Joe's return. She had no idea if he'd brought the sheriff or simply papers to divorce her, but right now she just wanted to see him. He had been gone for almost 10 days, and during that time, Mabel had realized that the feelings she had for Joe weren't of the type that would ever disappear. She loved him with her whole heart and would fight for him. If he handed her divorce papers, she would hand them right back and beg if she needed to. Eagle came out of the barn as Mabel stepped off the porch. Rosie jumped into the wagon, which Joe had stopped in the middle of the yard. She jumped onto Joe's lap, giving him a smacking kiss. Mabel laughed at the beautiful sight they made. Hopefully one day Joe would be just as welcoming to her embraces, she thought as she moved closer. Rosie jumped down from the wagon and rushed to Eagle before tugging him down to whisper in his ear. Mabel saw Joe reaching into the back of the wagon and picking up a basket. A frown creased her brow, wondering how far he had gone to get fresh produce, because that was the only time Joe used a basket. When he climbed down from the wagon, carefully holding the basket upright, Mabel's heart skipped a beat at how handsome he was. He turned and met her gaze, and Mabel's world almost tilted upright again. Joe might never forgive her for abandoning her son, but hopefully he could find it in his heart to love her, even if it was a little less than she hoped for. "What are you waiting for?" Joe asked her as his face split in two with a smile. "Don't you want to meet David?" "David?" Mabel frowned, confused for a moment until she saw 2 tiny feet kicking in the basket. Her knees quivered. Her heart exploded with joy even as she felt slightly dizzy. She hadn't even noticed Rosie and Eagle come closer. Only when Eagle steadied her by the arm did she realize he was at her side. Joe joined them and set the basket down before lifting the baby out. The baby gurgled up at him, clearly fond of his rescuer. "David, it's time for you to officially meet your ma. Mabel, meet your son, David Vallance. I hope you don't mind the last name." Mabel accepted her son into her arms, tears streaming over her cheeks as she took him in. He was much bigger than she remembered, but she smiled at his nose, remembering it as the first thing she noticed about him when he was born. She looked up, meeting Joe's eyes. "How did you... I can't," Joe shrugged. "None of that matters. All that matters is that our family is finally together. All of us." Eagle quietly stepped back as Rosie moved forward. "Is he my brother?" "Yes, he's your brother, Rosie," Joe said, picking up his daughter. Mabel was robbed of speech. She couldn't seem to find the right words. Instead, she just snuggled into Joe's side and reveled in the bliss of holding her child and being surrounded by her family. Epilogue. Utah, 1st of January 1885. Snow lay thick on the ground, the tree branches bare as they stood guarding the house, but smoke bubbled from the chimney and laughter sounded from inside. Outside, wagons lined up in front of the barn, the horses feasting on hay and carrots for the occasion. A few children had braved the cold and were having a snow fight, but inside, the adults had quieted down. They took their seats as the bride came out of her bedroom. A few gasps could be heard as Mabel walked into the living room. A makeshift aisle had been designed by moving furniture around to accommodate the people and the ceremony. Mabel couldn't stop herself from smiling as she saw Joe waiting for her in front of the fireplace. Beside him, Eagle held David in his one arm and Rosie on the other. This was her family, Mabel thought as she approached. Around her, The townsfolk smiled and sighed softly as she made her way to the fireplace. The preacher smiled broadly as Mabel joined him and Joe. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today on the first day of the new year to celebrate a new family." He glanced at Mabel and Joe in turn before he turned to the congregation and continued. "Both Joe and Mabel have faced challenges of their own in the past. Joe had lost a wife, and Mabel had been deceived by a man who had stolen 9 months of her life with her son. But today we're not here to commemorate the hard times or to focus on what they have lost. Instead, we are gathered here to celebrate what they have found. They found each other, they found family, and they found love. When I wed them a little more than 6 months ago, Mabel looked terrified and Joe very doubtful about whether he was doing right. But today, I stand here knowing that I am binding two people before God who love each other." Mabel smiled at Joe and knew that she had never been happier in her whole life. When Joe had suggested they renew their vows with both their children present this time, Mabel's heart had swelled with love. Today, she wasn't running from poverty or Matthew. She was here because she wanted to be nowhere else. After much back and forth with her lawyer in Boston, Mabel had finally sold the brownstone that had once been her home. Although it had been her childhood home, it now only reminded her of everything Matthew had taken from her. She had received a healthy sum from the sale. A healthy sum that would be used to expand the cabin, come spring. Because, come early fall, they would need another room. A smile curved her mouth as she thought of the baby she was carrying inside her. This time, she didn't doubt the father or feel ashamed because of the life growing inside her. She felt nothing but unbridled joy. Eagle had taken a shine to a girl in town, and it had been decided that since he was just as much a member of the family, it would only be right to build him a cabin of his own as well. Even after the expansion on their cabin and Eagle's cabin was built, there would still be enough money left over to invest in more cattle in her future. So I now ask you, do you, Joe Vallance, take this woman to be your wife, to honor, respect, obey, and protect her with everything that you are until the day you die?" the preacher asked, turning to Joe. Joe didn't even meet the preacher's gaze. Instead, he smiled into Mabel's eyes. "With everything that I am." "Me too," Mabel said out of turn, making everyone laugh. The preacher chuckled and shook his head. "My work here is done. I once again pronounce you husband and wife." Joe and Mabel shared a brief kiss before they reached for the children. As a family, they shared a moment, but the entire community could hear when the preacher spoke one last time. "I now pronounce you family." Rosie's laughter drifted on the air as wishes of congratulations were called out. But Mabel hardly heard them over the sound of her heart beating. For the first time since she lost her parents, it beat without fear, without guilt, without shame, and without doubt. She looked into Joe's eyes and knew that the preacher had been right. They had both lost, they had both suffered, and now they had both found joy again. Here on the wide-open plains where people feared to live, Mabel had found her home, and in Joe, she had found her soulmate. She glanced up at the roof of the cabin and smiled, knowing that although there was a time that she thought God had forgotten her name, she now knew that he never forgot about her at all. Instead, while she had been lacking in faith, he had worked tirelessly to secure her a future she never could have imagined. "Can we have the cake now?" Rosie asked, tugging at Mabel's dress. "Rosie, what do we say?" Joe quickly disciplined her. Rosie's smile twinkled with mischief as she began to sway from side to side. "Ma, please, can we have the cake now?" Mabel's smile broadened at the words. It was the first time Rosie had called her Ma. Neither she nor Joe wanted to force the little girl to address her as Ma, and to have her do it of her own made it so much more special. "Of course you can, my little rosebud." Mabel smiled at her daughter, knowing that it didn't matter where Rosie came from or that she hadn't loved her since birth. All that mattered was that they were now a family. The perfect prairie family. They have a second wedding, one in which the children were involved and where they could commit to their vows in love and not desperation.